There are difficult global challenges facing the world in the 21st century: increasing international trade, protecting the environment, sharing advancements in science and technology, and, of course, struggling to ensure basic human rights for all. While great strides have been made to improve the quality of life for many of the world's poor, for much of the world's population, life is still a day-to-day struggle to survive. Billions of people live on less than $2 a day. Unemployment, poverty, hunger, and disease continue to be the hallmarks of the developing world. Perhaps nowhere are these issues more profound than on the continent of Africa. Africa is the second largest continent and is considered to be the cradle of civilization, where humankind originated millions of years ago. Over the centuries, great African civilizations have risen and fallen. Today, it is a vast land of many nations, with many cultures, languages, and traditions. Africa is also a continent rich in diamonds, oil, and gold. But it is largely comprised of struggling, developing nations trying to provide peace and prosperity for their people while fighting a deadly disease, HIV/AIDS.
Number one problem in Africa is the poor level of development. Countries which have income per capita of $500, $600 really can't accomplish any of the other social goals that they would want to. They can't educate their children, they can't provide health care, fight off AIDS, and it becomes very hard to become democratic.
Why is a continent so incredibly rich in natural resources also so poor? There have been vast improvements in literacy, nutrition, and standards of living on the continent. Yet internal and global forces continue to prevent much of Africa from joining the developed world. To understand Africa's present condition, it helps to look at its past. In 1884, a group of 14 European nations met at a conference in Berlin, Germany, and divided Africa into 50 countries. 2 centuries of slave trading had come to an end, but the need for raw materials to fuel its industrial revolution sent Europeans back to Africa.
The Europeans were now no longer going to Africa looking for labor, but they were starting to get interested in the products of Africa itself. And so they got together at the Berlin Conference to divide Africa up on paper so that the European countries wouldn't get into wars with each other.
The major winners were France, which got most of West Africa, Great Britain, which had a string of colonies from Egypt to South Africa, Portugal with Mozambique and Angola, and Germany with Togo, Cameroon, Tanzania, and Namibia. Only Ethiopia and Liberia retained their independence. Belgium received control of the Congo, a huge area with more than 200 ethnic groups. King Leopold II made the Congo his personal colony, treating the people as virtual slaves and contributing to the deaths of millions.
He would just give huge tracts of land about the size of the state of Connecticut. Actually, one of them was 5 times as large as Belgium itself, to large companies that had private armies. And they would just go in with their private armies and order people to bring wild rubber and ivory and set quotas.
From the beginning, there were protests against colonial rule. In the Congo, there were riots demanding independence when Belgium was slow in granting the people a voice in government. Struggles for independence were both long and bloody, but by the mid-1960s, the majority of African states were free from colonial rule. But independence did not solve Africa's problems.
Watch out! Africa! Watch out!
Violence erupted among ethnic groups in these artificially created nations, leading to civil war in many countries like Nigeria and Chad. Though colonial rule lasted less than 100 years, the effects were profound. The new political boundaries cut across ethnic homelands, forcing people to assimilate into new societies and institutions. Colonial powers had not developed popular democracies, making it much harder to establish stable governments later on. Economic systems developed based on the world's desire for raw materials rather than local necessities.
These countries are, by and large, only 40 years old. Most came to independence in the early to mid-1960s. And it is very, very difficult to move from the status of a colony to stable, prosperous countries in a few decades.
Africans were never encouraged, or in some cases were not even allowed, to industrialize, to create factories, to modernize, or things like that. The idea was that they were to be a cheap source of raw materials. So once the larger powers cut them loose, then they still had this imbalance that hasn't been corrected to this day.
The effects of colonial rule are most striking in the history of South Africa, one of the largest, richest, and most beautiful countries on the continent. In the years after gaining its independence from Britain in 1910, the nation came to be ruled by a white minority, a group known as Afrikaners. In 1948, they imposed a system of forced racial segregation based on what they considered to be white superiority. This system was called apartheid. Apartheid continued for nearly 50 years. Open elections were held in 1994, and Nelson Mandela, a leader of the African National Congress, the main opposition to the apartheid government, became South Africa's president. Mandela had spent 26 years in prison for his activism against the previous government.
Now is the time for celebration, for South Africans to join together to celebrate the birth of democracy.
Although apartheid no longer exists, South Africa is still trying to come to terms with its racist past.
Tremendous progress has been made in providing schools, clinics, water, electricity to millions of people who didn't have it before. There has been desegregation in South Africa. All forms of official racial discrimination have been eliminated, but if you fly over South Africa, go over from neighborhood to neighborhood, you see that it is still a country that is racially divided.
As is the case with many of the world's oldest civilizations, Africa has a history of enslavement that dates to ancient times. The first enslaved people were probably prisoners of war. In Africa, slavery was widespread from about the 8th century, when North African Arabs enslaved black Africans as laborers. Slavery soared with the coming of the Europeans in the 15th century, particularly when they established plantations in the Americas and needed cheap labor. By the 1800s, an estimated 12 million enslaved men, women, and children were brought across the notorious Middle Passage to the Americas from West Africa, the largest forced migration in recorded history. The official slave trade waned when it was outlawed by many countries in the 1800s, but in some ways, it never went away.
In countries with such low per capita incomes, a large number of absolutely desperate people are forced to do almost anything for some kind of living for themselves and their family. That's a type of slavery also which is much greater across the continent.
Poverty, the demand for cheap labor, and lax enforcement of laws in underdeveloped countries are prime causes of modern slavery. Chattel enslavement, where people are viewed as property, is still a problem in African countries like the Sudan and Mauritania. And in African countries with devastated economies, poor people are often forced or tricked into selling women and children into enslavement, or are forced to become slaves themselves. It's particularly bad in West Africa, where enslaved children work on cocoa, coffee, and cotton farms.
When they come, they start shooting randomly. When they come to a village, they surround it, then they start shooting. Whoever happened to be there is to be taken, and if you resist, then they will kill you.
According to the U.S. State Department, countries like the Ivory Coast, Ghana, and Mali are making significant efforts to stop this trafficking in human beings. In 2004, the United Nations launched its international commemoration of the struggle against slavery and its abolition to not only remember slavery's tragic history, but also to end its modern forms. Through their education programs, the UN and other groups such as Anti-Slavery International aim to draw attention to the global problem of human trafficking. They are calling for national and international policy changes that will punish traffickers and protect people's rights. The UN estimated that 38 million people in Africa were at risk for starvation in 2003. Poverty is a major cause of this problem. Droughts, such as those in Zimbabwe, Somalia, and Ethiopia, are also to blame. But many experts say that hunger and famine are often caused by governments rather than the weather.
In most countries, even during famine, there is enough food to feed the people. It's just that the transport governmental systems have broken down to such an extent that people starve. So famine is a political problem brought on in the context of difficult ecological circumstances, yes, but it is one that is eminently preventable.
Poor economic policies also contribute to food shortages. Land reform is promoted as a way to give land to poor people so they can grow food for local consumption. But such reform can make matters worse, as it did in Zimbabwe. Beginning in 2000, Zimbabwe's dictator, Robert Mugabe, allowed poor blacks to confiscate white-owned land.
Mugabe has said, well, so what? What happens to a couple of thousand white farmers whose land has been seized? But on those farms, among other things, were several 100,000 black farm workers who were displaced, who have lost their livelihood, and who are roaming the country looking for something to do. And at the same time, food production and economic activity in the country has plummeted. In the interim, people try to survive. People try to hang on.
The problems of hunger and malnourishment exist in many parts of the continent. But nowhere have they hit harder than in sub-Saharan Africa. Beyond the obvious toll in human suffering, these conditions create an enormous health crisis for the people of these areas, opening the door for a number of chronic diseases. Poor harvests, a lack of clean drinking water, and unstable economies have also meant that many children suffer from malnutrition. Whole populations suffer from such diseases as cholera, typhoid, yellow fever, and river blindness that are preventable and curable.
One of the things that's been most striking to me as a teacher is that for my generation, we think about global threats mostly in terms of traditional security, one nation invading another, one nation destroying another. For many people growing up today, the biggest threats are the millions of people losing their lives through disease.
Major efforts are underway to prevent these diseases. In 2002, African nations meeting in South Africa agreed to implement programs designed to significantly reduce the number of people living without clean drinking water and sanitation. Millions of children suffer and die each year in Africa from severe diarrhea caused by unsafe water. Malaria is another major killer in Africa. Spread by mosquitoes, the disease can be prevented, sometimes in very simple ways.
Here's the solution. Give them some bed nets, which are, you sleep under these netting, and that stops the mosquitoes from biting, and it lowers maybe by half or even more than half the number of young children that will die of that disease through that very simple approach.
less simple is the AIDS crisis, which is exacerbated by poverty and lack of education. By 1989, most African countries reported at least one HIV/AIDS case. In the decade that followed, over 25 million people were infected. Now, more than half of all of those infected by HIV/AIDS worldwide are in sub-Saharan Africa.
Because the silence of HIV/AIDS and the stigma associated with being positive, most of those people don't choose to speak and reveal their status. President Kaunda at the time from Zambia announced that his son was dying of AIDS. And it was pretty phenomenal for a president of a country to come out and say, this is happening to me, this is happening to my family.
Uganda is a country where HIV/AIDS rates have stabilized due to an aggressive prevention campaign. In 2004, with the help of millions of dollars from the United Nations Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, Uganda began distributing free generic HIV drugs. The hope is that funding for programs such as this will increase so African countries can treat all who need help. Due to the legacy of colonialism, political instability, and economic weakness, Africa is finding it difficult to compete in the global economy of the modern world. Africa has had help from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, institutions set up by the industrialized countries to provide development aid and loans to developing countries. But these programs are not handouts. Nations accepting the money have been required to implement economic reforms, sell more and spend less, deregulate and open their markets to competition, and institute tight monetary policies. But these measures often don't take into account local conditions. Some policy recommendations actually increased poverty and illiteracy in several countries. Zambia ended up spending more on its debt payments than on health and education combined. When Uganda decided to go against World Bank advice and dropped an $8 annual school fee in 1997, school attendance more than doubled within 2 years. Partly due to international pressure, the World Bank now opposes school fees, but continues to push for healthcare fees. Also, trade policies of the industrialized world often impede efforts to establish thriving economies in Africa. While there are aid programs to help African farmers raise cash crops like tobacco and sugar to be sold abroad, the aid is undermined by tariffs and subsidies industrialized countries use to protect their own agricultural products. This prevents African countries from competing with cotton from the US and China, or cereals and dairy products from Europe.
They're doing, in fact, exactly what we had asked them to do, become globally competitive, and it's we who have shut the markets. If we were to reduce subsidies to agriculture, we would do far more for Africa than all the foreign aid that we've piled in, much of which has had very limited effect, because when farmers grow things and sell them, they get the money themselves and are able to make decisions for themselves and their families.
Frustration with these agricultural subsidies overflowed in September 2003 when developing countries, led by nations such as Nigeria and Kenya, walked out of international trade talks in Cancun, Mexico, over the lack of movement on this issue. Even when Africa has commodities the industrialized world wants, it is difficult for some of the countries to reap the benefits. Rebel forces in Sierra Leone, Angola, Liberia, and the current Democratic Republic of Congo have funded civil wars with diamonds mined from the areas they control. Another raw material that is both a blessing and a curse for Africa is oil. Oil output is increasing rapidly in Africa as the United States, in particular, looks for alternatives to importing oil from the Middle East. Oil provides millions of dollars in revenue to countries like Nigeria, Angola, and Equatorial Guinea. But because of corrupt governments and questionable multinational business practices, these countries have not been able to convert that oil wealth into prosperity for the majority of their people?
That's the great question of the day for the Africans. The overwhelming development experience of oil has been miserable in Africa and the Middle East. A great many oil-producing countries are poorer than they were 25 years ago. Each government whose oil comes online says, we'll be different, we'll get it right. So far, most have been unable to do so.
With all the global problems facing Africa today, the real issue remains the difficult conditions that many of its people suffer through each and every day.
Can something be done about that? The answer, in my opinion, is yes. The rich countries have to find more effective ways to help the poor build the hospitals and the clinics and the schools and even the roads and the power so that those people could get a base from which to achieve economic growth, and that means economic progress year after year to get them out of poverty.
Despite the bleak picture that many see when they think of Africa, the continent has enormous potential, and efforts are underway to improve things, from the economy to health to the everyday lives of the people.
I'm hopeful because the people I've met in parts of Africa and Asia and Latin America who are out there every day making a difference. I see youth who are creating anti-AIDS clubs in their schools, who are out talking with each other about being peer educators and sharing information with each other. I see parents learning to talk to their kids about sexuality and being safe, and what does that mean. Human resilience is there, and people are not going to give up.
During the next century, Africa is going to need to industrialize to create the jobs for the growing population. People will need jobs in the cities, and they will need industrial jobs. So I see some kind of a big industrial revolution arriving in Africa during the 21st century. I don't know when and I don't know how, but it seems inevitable.